Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a battle between 5 different all-in-ones. What I mean by all-in-one is that all of these are a DAC and headphone amp, and also preamp in most cases. They're all of that wrapped into a single box. I happen to have been sent a few of these for review, all in short order, and so I thought rather than do individual reviews where inevitably I would have compared them against each other anyway, I thought let's just start off by comparing all of the all-in-ones that I have handy. And that's up to a certain price point, so these all sit under the $1,000 mark. There are of course more expensive all-in-ones out there, like the Burson conductors that I recently reviewed, that being the 3GT and the 3XGT, and also something like the Chord Hugo TT2. So there are more expensive and better all-in-ones out there, but these are some excellent options for under $1,000. Because I've got 5 different products to go through here, this is going to be a pretty big review. So make sure you grab yourself your favourite drink, maybe grab a snack, use the chapter markers if you feel the need to, but keep in mind that there are lots of twists and turns in here, not because I created it that way. This was meant to be a pretty simple comparison, but as I delved deeper and deeper into what each of these devices did, I found a few quirks and a few bits and pieces that I think really need to be explained. So I do recommend watching the whole thing because there are going to be bits and pieces I share as I go through. And so with that in mind, grab your favourite drink, grab yourself a snack, and enjoy this battle between 5 fantastic all-in-ones. I want to start off by saying a huge thanks to HiFiMan and also Apos Audio for making this battle possible. This wasn't planned with either of those companies, it just so happens that Apos had previously sent me the DX5 and the FiiO K9 Pro ESS, and then recently sent me the SMSL M500 Mk3, as well as the new topping DX7 Pro. 7 Pro Plus, I should say. HiFiMan unknowingly came to the party by sending me the EF400, and so as I've already said, because all of this came in at the same time, we're here doing this battle. The other thing I want to cover off now, because it gets it out of the way for all the different testing and comparisons that I did, is that I used a range of IEMs and headphones for this test. Specifically, I was using the T-Audio Monarch Mark II as an IEM, the Sennheiser HD820 as a high impedance headphone, and the HiFiMan Arius Stealth Edition as a more lower impedance headphone, but in both cases headphones that require a little bit of juice to get the most out of, and that will become relevant. I did also try some other headphones for more casual listening as I got used to these, but the specific testing was with those 2 earphones and the IEM. So in case you're wondering, this battle is going to take into account the sound quality of the devices, the interface and the usability of the devices, the power outputs of them, how effectively they drive low impedance headphones, high impedance headphones, and IEMs, and also how they operate as DACs/preamps. So I'm going to cover all that ground, and that's why I say this is going to be a big one, and there are some unexpected imperfections and twists and turns as we go along this journey. So let's jump straight into it without any further delay, starting off with the most affordable option here in the topping DX5. This is a $449 unit. I've reviewed it separately on the channel, so I'll put a link down below where you can go and check out the review of that one if you want an in-depth look. But to give you a quick summary, the DX5 uses a couple of ES9068 DAC chips from ESS, it takes up to DSD64 via USB, and through the coaxial and optical inputs, it's capped at 192 kHz and 24-bit. It supports Bluetooth including high-res codecs, as well as MQA, and it'll output 1.8 watts into a 32 ohm load. So it's got plenty of power, it's got a great set of features, and on paper everything looks pretty good. Something that's worth noting if you don't watch the full review is that even though the DX5 offers both an XLR output and a 6.3mm, it's a single-ended design for the output stage. As I understand it, the DAC output from the back, if we turn the unit around, my understanding is that these are proper balanced XLR outputs for preamp or DAC use. But from the front, you're getting the same output from both of these. The XLR socket is just for convenience. Now, I personally don't care about that. I know some people have an issue with it, but for me, as you would have known if you've seen the recent Conductor 3 GT review, sometimes single-ended is actually better. And so I have no issues with the front outputs being single-ended. If we look at the back of the unit quickly, what you'll see is that, as I've already said, we've got XLR outputs. There's also a pair of RCA outputs covered by the caps there. And then you've got your Bluetooth antenna, optical, USB, and SPDIF coaxial input. So it's a nice simple unit. It's a nice compact design. I really like the new look of the topping units. And ultimately, what you'll know if you've watched the review of the DX5 is that it's got a good, solid sound. It's punchy, it's energetic, it's got a sense of life to it. It does have a slightly kind of overemphasized sound, a slightly artificial enhancement to the sound, but in isolation it's not something you notice so much as when you put it up against other devices. It's a product that after I reviewed it, I very happily and comfortably recommended it. As is often the case, you can get better sound by spending more money, but at its price, I think the DX5 is really solid. And so for me, I was particularly interested to see what happened when I compared it to the SMSL M500 Mk3. So this is the brand new version. It looks pretty much the same as the old one until you fire it up and you have a close look. But this new M500 Mk3 comes in at $530 US. And that makes it about $80 more than the DX5, and I was curious to see if you got better sound, better performance, better functionality for your extra $80 US. Let's start off by highlighting some of the differences and similarities between the two. And the first thing is that the M500 Mk3 is using a different DAC chip and only one DAC chip. In this case, it's the ES9038 Pro chip, but importantly, SMSL have made it very clear that they're using all 8 channels from the 9038 chip. And so whilst it is only one DAC chip, it's outputting 8 different channels of audio, and what that means is you're essentially getting 4 outputs for the left and 4 outputs for the right. So even though it's not a dual chip design like it is in the DX5, there are some potential other benefits in the M500, but as always, there's not a clear-cut answer that DAC chip X is better than DAC chip Y. It all comes down to how it's used. Where the M500 does demonstrate some clear superiority is that it will handle DSD all the way up to 512, and on the SPDIF inputs, that being optical and coaxial, it'll not only handle 192 kHz and 24-bit, but also DSD64. So if you are somebody that has any need for DSD via those SPDIF connections, then the M500 will do it. The Mark III, I don't know about the Mark II version, the M500 Mark III will do it, the DX5 won't. In terms of Bluetooth and MQA, this is identical to the DX5. Both support Bluetooth high-res codecs and also MQA. Where the DX5 has an edge though is in the power output. We had 1.8 watts into 32 ohms from the DX5 versus only 1 watt from the M500 Mark III. That said, having tested it with both the ARIA Stealth Edition, which is moderately difficult to drive, and also with the HD820, which is a 300 ohm headphone, the M500 still handles both of those just fine. I wouldn't want it to drive something like a Susvara, but realistically, if you're driving a headphone like the Susvara, you probably should be focusing on better quality gear. For those of you that might have, say, the HE6 SE from HiFiMan, which is also very difficult to drive, then I don't recommend the M500 from a power point of view, and you probably would want either an external amplifier or a completely different all-in-one. And that's where you're better off coming back over to something like the DX5 or maybe one of the other all-in-ones I've got here, and we'll get to those soon. Before I do a direct sound comparison between the DX5 and the M500 here, I just want to mention a couple of other features that the M500 has that separates it from the DX5. One of them is what's called sound color, and this is something that pops up on a number of SMSL devices. Basically what I understand it to be doing is adding some deliberate distortion, so different harmonics of distortion or something similar, into the sound to give some extra emphasis to the treble, that being what they call the crystal sound color, to the mid-range, which is what they call the tube sound color, or to the bass frequencies, which is what they call a rich sound color. I haven't seen measurements of these to know exactly what's going on, but certainly when you listen to it, the crystal, tube, and richness sound colors enhance the different frequencies based on what I can hear anyway. It's quite subtle, so it's not a dramatic shift, but it does seem to make some change. For all my testing, just to be clear, it stayed on no sound color being added. And that's true for any of these. If there was any kind of sound coloration available, as there is in the DX7 Pro Plus, we'll talk about that shortly too, it always stayed on the uncolored sound because it's something I think you can choose to add in later, but I wanted to compare all of these on an equal playing field. The final thing I want to mention before I give you a quick tour of the M500 and also talk about its sound, of course, is that I really like the interface on the M500. In the case of the topping DX5, the menu system I find a little bit hard to access because you've got this single control knob that's acting as your selector switch for your outputs, and therefore you really need to use the remote control if you want to access the menu on the DX5. In the case of the M500 though, the control knob here does allow you to change inputs, but through the menu system. And so with a single press of the control knob, you're straight into the menu and all of your options are presented before you. It does make accessing some of those choices, like the outputs, a little bit slower, but I like the fact that if I don't want to use remote control because the unit's right here in front of me on the desk, as it is in my case, then I like the fact that this lets me do it. The DX5, I have to go and grab the remote control. Now I know that that's a pretty small thing and for some people it's completely irrelevant, but I definitely like it for a desktop style setup. The other thing I really like is the nice clean display that the M500 gives you. I'm not necessarily a fan of the PCM font, it looks a bit cartoonish, whereas everything else looks very clean and digital. So there's a bit of a mismatch of fonts there, but other than that, it's completely fine. While we're talking about the interface, let's do a quick tour. So on the front of the device, things are pretty simple. You've got this nice display. It's a nice, clean, multicolored display. You've then got the control knob, which is the power button, the volume knob, and also your menu selection function, so rotating through the options and clicking to select them. You've then got both a 6.3 and a 4.4mm output, but just like the DX5, both of these are single-ended outputs. So the 4.4mm is there for convenience. It's not a fully balanced output as far as I can tell. The power figures coming out are both the same, regardless of which you plug into, and the sound is basically the same as well. Again, I don't mind that, but I know some people want to see a proper balanced output, and that's entirely up to you, of course. But in the case of the M500, you're not going to get that. On the back of the M500, we've got a fairly unique little Bluetooth antenna that sticks straight out instead of having the elbow. And then we've got the standard style inputs. You've got USB-B, you've got optical, coaxial, and then you've got a set of analog outputs being both XLR and RCA. So in that respect, it's very, very similar to the DX5. In fact, really the only differences are the interface, the sample rates that the M500 will handle being a bit higher, and the fact that the M500 has a bit less power. But other than that, they're very, very similar units. So let's talk now about how they sound, because that's where we start to differentiate them. The M500 has a sound that I would describe as wonderfully smooth, but still very, very detailed. It's a less fatiguing sound to me than what the DX5 provides, because the DX5 has that slightly sort of artificial enhancement to some of the sounds. The staging and imaging presentation of the M500 is a little bit closer to you than the DX5. It's a little bit more mid-forward as well, so the mid-range just feels a bit closer to you as a listener, not super close, not right up in your face, but closer than the DX5. And I feel like the soundstage is just a little tiny bit narrower, but it does also have just a little bit more depth than the DX5 does. Now, generally speaking, these Delta Sigma chip-based DACs, I think all of these, except for the R2R in the EF400, I think all of these are Sabre-based DACs, and they all lack depth in general. But depending on the tuning, you can get a small sense of depth, and I feel like the M500 does give you that. So you're trading off a little bit of width, but you're getting a tiny bit of depth, and I personally prefer the overall presentation, both tonality and the staging, from the M500. And in fact, overall, I find the M500 to be a generally pleasing listen. It's smooth, but it's got plenty of detail. It's a fairly intimate soundstage, but not at all congested, and with a good sense of imaging separation and space between sounds. For me, both the DX5 and the M500 are still really solid options. But for that extra $80 US, I personally feel like the M500 is better. You're getting a better interface in my opinion, an easier, smoother interface at least. You're getting a smoother and more realistic sound in my opinion, with no loss of detail, so this doesn't get rich and thick and warm. It just has a more natural, more organic style sound. You're also getting those higher sample rate capabilities if you need that. And I personally really like the narrow, thin footprint rather than the wider footprint of the DX5, but that is very personal. You might be completely different, and that's all going to depend on where you're placing the device. So for me, if we're just talking about sonics and interface only, I do think the M500 Mk3 is the better option than the DX5 for that $80 US more, but I can't stress enough that both are very good. I do recommend the DX5 if you're going to stay under $500 US, but if you can creep above 500, the M500 Mk3 is fantastic. But let's see how it stacks up against some even high-priced units, because if you spend just $69 US more, you can get yourself the HiFiMan EF400. Let's check that one out now. The HiFiMan EF400 here is probably the most different product in this whole roundup. First of all, it's the only R2R DAC in this lineup, and secondly, it's basically got no bells and whistles at all. There's no menu system, there's no display on it, other than a light indicating which gain mode and sample mode you're in, and I'll get to that in a moment. It's a very basic no-frills device. To illustrate that, it's a very simple front of the unit. We've got a selector switch over here, which moves between the gain modes, high and low gain, and also oversampling and non-oversampling. And those are the sample rates I just spoke about. And then on the other side, we've got a volume knob, which is just a volume knob. It doesn't do anything else at all. And in between those two are a few outputs. We've got a 6.3mm output, a 3.5mm output, so both of those are single-ended. And then we've got true balanced outputs in the form of 4.4mm and 4-pin XLR. So this is the first unit here that's actually offering us a true balanced output for your headphones. But if we swing around to the back, what you'll see is a very simple back panel. Once again, we've got the XLR and RCA outputs to take the DAC output and bypass the internal amp to send it to an external amplifier of your choice. But it's worth noting that there's no preamp functionality on this one. So unlike all the other units here where you can choose to have a variable output if you want it, with the EF400 it is only used as a DAC or an all-in-one. There is no preamp functionality. Further to that, what you might be noticing looking at the back of this is it's only going to take a USB input. There's no coaxial, there's no optical, there's just USB-C or USB-B. So this is very much designed to be just a computer-based, or you could use it with a smartphone or a tablet, but essentially a computer-style transport feeding directly into the unit, and that's it. You don't get Bluetooth, you don't get SPDIF, you don't get any of the other different formats. And so realistically, what we're saying here is that you're paying more for this than you are for the M500 and for the DX5, theoretically for the pleasure of better sound quality, because it's got no features to speak for it, and therefore it must in theory sound better. And that's the big question, is does it? Before I answer that question though, let's talk a little bit about some of the key features and functions of the EF400. And some of these I've already covered off, but just to clarify, the EF400 uses HiFiMan's own Himalaya R2R DAC technology. As I've already said, it offers OS or oversampling mode and NOS or non-oversampling mode. It's a true balanced design, meaning that the headphone outputs are balanced for the 4.4mm and the 4-pin XLR. But beyond that, it really doesn't have any other key features. There's no DSD capabilities, there's no Bluetooth as I've already said, there's no MQA. And when it comes to the power figures, they're interesting too. Because the quoted output of the EF400, the maximum quoted output is 4.4 watts. But interestingly, HiFiMan haven't actually clarified which impedance that's happening at. And that makes it a bit difficult to compare to these others because we don't know whether that's at 32 ohms, at 64 ohms, at 8 ohms, it could be anywhere along there. But I will talk in a moment about the fact that I'm pretty sure that maximum power output is based on the current available, but we'll talk about that soon and I'll explain what I mean by that. The one final feature, or actually a drawback that I want to mention here, is that we've got an analog volume pot here. All of these other units use digital volume, meaning that it is absolutely level balanced from the moment there's sound all the way through to maximum volume. It also gives you more precise control, that being digital. Whereas with the analog control on the EF400, it means two things. Firstly, it does get loud pretty quickly. You don't have the very, very fine increments that you can get from these digital controls. And also, there is, as you'd expect from an analog volume control, very, very slight channel imbalance at the very lowest levels. And so when using with an IEM, this volume control isn't particularly ideal, and even with some sensitive headphones, I had trouble getting a good range of volume out of it. Talking about sound quality now, and the EF400 gives a sound that is quite full, quite rich, and not quite as well controlled as something like the M500. It's got a sound that in the oversampling mode is quite similar to the M500, but just a little bit looser than it. And I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. Some people will prefer this sound, but it's not quite as controlled as the M500. Moving over to NOS mode relaxes things even further, and whilst I really enjoy the sound of this in NOS mode, I do think it's going to get a little bit too soft for some people. For a bit more specific context, let's talk now about a specific track, and on this occasion it's In Full Swing by Ronnie Jordan. On that track, using the EF400 here with the Sennheiser HD820, I found myself preferring the NOS mode, that's the non-oversampling mode, when listening to that combination. The sound is quite spacious, there's a good sense of clarity, but it doesn't get etched, it doesn't get edgy at all. The bass has a nice sense of presence and weight, but it's still pretty well controlled. Taking the HD820s over to the M500, and what I heard was a tonality that was pretty similar. So from a tonal point of view, both of these devices have a fairly rich and organic sound. And I don't mean that they're going to lushness and overly warm, thick sounds, but they both have a smoother and a more organic sound. And I know the term organic doesn't really tell us much at all, but it's a sound that comes across to me as being more lifelike and more realistic. Where the key difference lies between these two is the M500 just feels like it's got a bit better control over the sound. And again, that could be for better or worse. For some people, the slightly more relaxed sound from the EF400 is going to be preferable. For others, the slightly tighter control is going to come across as being more hi-fi. The M500 particularly has a bit more definition in the top end, and without ever getting etched or harsh or too forceful in the top end, it is providing that sense of extra control and extra detail, whereas the EF400 feels that little bit more relaxed. One area that I feel like the EF400 does have an edge is that it definitely, to me, produces a slightly greater sense of space in the sound. So you can hear that there's a bit more space between each instrument. The overall soundstage isn't massively bigger, but the general sense of space between sounds is clearer and better defined on the EF400. Not that the M500 is bad, but I feel like the EF400 just does it a bit better, and it's likely because there's just a bit more depth in the soundstage compared to the M500. Moving over to the HiFiMan Arias now, this being the stealth version, and I felt like with the Arias on the EF400, both the oversampling and non-oversampling modes were both probably equally enjoyable. Once again, the non-oversampling mode does provide that little bit more sense of space, but it comes at the cost of a little bit of perceived detail. Now, whether or not that detail is actually there is probably debatable, but it certainly doesn't seem as present in the mix as it does with oversampling. And it's not vastly different, but there is a difference there. Moving the Arias over to the M500, and we're still listening to the same track, and what I found was that on the M500, the Aria's slightly brighter treble did reveal the M500 to have just a little bit more of a sense of digitalness to its sound. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. My point is that you can hear from the M500 that there's a little bit more emphasis and kind of clarity, you probably could say, in the treble. It doesn't get harsh, it doesn't get nasty, but it's a bit different from the EF400. And those with brighter headphones, more aggressively treble-tuned headphones, may prefer the EF400's slightly more laid-back sound. In contrast, if you've got a warmer headphone, you might prefer the slightly more detailed sound, the slightly more treble-emphasized sound of the M500. Now, I just said slightly treble-emphasized sound of the M500. My point is, in comparison, it's got slightly treble-emphasized sound. In isolation, I actually think the M500 is probably the closer to neutral sound, whereas the EF400 is probably slightly laid back from what is true to life and realistic. As is always the case, I don't know how the original recording was meant to sound, so I'm only guessing at this when I talk about these two. But having listened to them across a whole range of tracks, the EF400 definitely comes across just that touch more laid back, but only a small amount. And so after trying the M500 and the EF400, both on the track I just mentioned, but also some others as well, I feel like for me, I very slightly prefer the overall sound quality from the EF400, but it's a really, really close call. If I was deciding entirely on sound quality, the EF400 would get my nod, with a caveat that I'll get to in a moment. But you do have to recognise that you're trading off a huge number of functions and features when comparing to the M500. And so to be clear, up until this point, the M500 was leading the battle because I think it's comfortably better than the DX5. But when we get to the EF400, things are less clear. The EF400 wins by a small margin on sound quality, but the M500 is clearly the more versatile device. And so to help you work out which one is leading the battle for you right now, let me tell you a couple more things about the EF400. Firstly, even though it does have truly balanced and truly single-ended outputs, there is a slight change in performance when you go from single-ended to balanced. Everything I've spoken about to this point has been with the balanced outputs. I always try to test a device at its maximum potential. And when I moved over to the single-ended outputs, I heard what I generally hear when I have a device that has both balanced and single-ended. And that is that moving over to single-ended, you lose a little bit of the separation in the sound, a little bit of width in the soundstage, but what you gain in return is a slightly stronger sense of note weight and presence in the music. And so I wouldn't say for a second that the single-ended output is worse, but it is different and it's worth taking that into account. If you're jumping back and forth between different headphones, one being single-ended and one being balanced, you are going to get a slightly different experience depending on which outputs you use here. But that's not the biggest thing that I think further separates these two. The final thing I want to mention is that even though this has got 4.4 watts of maximum output power, something's not quite right with high impedance cans. When I was listening to the HD820s and going back and forth between the EF400 and the M500, I didn't really notice that there was any issue with how the EF400 was driving the 820s. But as I played around a little bit more, partly due to some conversations with patrons and another review that had mentioned some issues driving high impedance cans with the EF400, once I started testing that a bit further, I found that something's going wrong when it's driving those 300 ohm plus headphones. And when I say something's going wrong, what I mean is that the sound that you get from the EF400 with something like an Aria, that being a lower impedance planar magnetic driver, that's spacious, it's detailed, it's smooth, it's a really nice experience. But if you compare the sound of that to then going to a higher impedance headphone, what I started to notice was that the depth in the soundstage starts to disappear, and some of the dynamics do as well. For some reason, when you plug in a 300 ohm headphone, and I tried this with the HD820s, with the ZMF Verite Open, and also with the ZMF Atriums, across all three of those, the sound gets a bit flat and a bit lacking in dynamics from the EF400. It's not bad, but it's not as good as it can sound with a lower impedance headphone. And it doesn't seem to matter whether it's a dynamic or a planar magnetic. It's about the impedance, it seems. And whilst I don't know for sure what's going to be causing that, I do wonder if it's maybe something to do with the voltage swing available. Maybe this amplifier circuit has been designed to really optimize the output for those current-hungry headphones, those being the less sensitive, lower impedance headphones, and therefore doesn't have the voltage swing required for a higher impedance headphone. That's all I can think of that would be causing this. I might be off the mark. But what I do know for sure is that this is not a device that I would recommend for those wanting to drive a high impedance headphone. It's wonderful for lower impedance, let's say below 100 ohms, I can absolutely guarantee it's going to sound great. But if you're using a wide range of headphones including high impedance cans, you're probably going to want an external amplifier to pair up with the EF400 for those high impedance cans. And so take that into account and let me know in the comments down below at this stage in the video, is the M500 or the EF400 your current winner? Not necessarily the winner of the overall battle, but of the DX5, the M500 and the EF400, which one would you choose and why? While you're writing that down in the comments, let's move on to the next challenger in the topping DX7 Pro Plus. Now I want to give you a quick introduction to this one because this is brand new on the market. This is a collaboration between Topping and Apos, and it's designed to replace and improve upon the old DX7 Pro. I know many of you love the original DX7 Pro, lots of you have asked for my review, and I apologise that I don't have the original here to compare, but the DX7 Pro Plus comes in with a lot of heritage behind it, a lot of fans behind the previous version, and at $100 more than the EF400, with a few extra features under its belt compared to the DX5, and a greater power output than the M500, there's a lot going for the DX7 Pro Plus. So let's talk now about its key features, how it differs from the other, and put it into context before we talk about sound. The DX7 Pro Plus uses exactly the same DAC chip as the M500, that being the ES9038 Pro. It handles all the same higher sample rates that the M500 does, so far they're identical. It's got the same Bluetooth capabilities. The DX7 Pro Plus doesn't have MQA if that's an issue for you, but it does give you more power into 32 ohms than either the DX5 or the M500. So the DX7 Pro Plus will output 1.9 watts into 32 ohms compared to 1.8 from the DX5. It's worth noting that once again, with the DX7 Pro Plus, the balanced outputs here are just for convenience only. As far as I can tell, looking at the specifications and the marketing information, this is still a single-ended only headphone output stage. So it's a balanced DAC, as all of them here are, but a single-ended headphone amp stage with some convenience-based balanced connectors. And so at this point, you might be thinking, why bother with the DX7 Pro Plus? It's no different from the DX5 really. It's 100 milliwatts different. Is it actually going to change anything? But let's turn it around and have a look at the back, because there are two key things and one of them is there. As you look at the back panel, what you'll start to notice is that we've got a lot more inputs and outputs, or specifically inputs. We've got the same XLR and RCA outputs, which again, like the DX5 and the M500, are variable, so you can use this as a preamp and or a DAC. But where things start to get really interesting is the DX7 Pro Plus gives you an HDMI connection down here for I2S, and also an AES connection. So you've got some high quality connection standards, and in particular, I'm a huge fan of I2S. In the limited testing I've done of I2S, it's consistently always come out sounding a bit better than USB, and so if you happen to have a transport with I2S, or you're able to connect up to something like a Topping U90 or a Singer SU6 USB bridge device, then you can really maximize the sound of the DX7 Pro Plus. And just to clarify there, what I mean when I say you can get better sound is that when I use the DX7 Pro Plus via I2S compared to via USB, and for this testing I was using a high quality USB card in my computer via a high quality USB cable, and comparing that to running the Singer SU6 USB bridge, running a high quality HDMI cable into the I2S socket, in both of those setups, the sound was really good, but the I2S just had a slightly better sense of detail retrieval, very slight in that regard, but more importantly, it had a better sense of refinement at the same time. And so I'm a huge fan of the fact that this has got I2S. That's becoming more and more important to me as a reviewer and a purchaser, is if I can get a product with I2S, it immediately goes ahead of an equivalent product without it. Of course, the end sound quality is still important, but I love seeing it creep into more designs. Something else that the DX7 Pro Plus offers, and you can't see it, is that inside the menu system, this also offers you a balance control, which is great for those of you that might have a unilateral hearing loss, or maybe you need to balance out the sound because your speakers aren't exactly the same distance from you. But it also gives you a slight tone control where you can choose to add second order harmonics or third order harmonics to change the character of the sound. Now, this isn't a feature that I tend to ever use, much like the sound colors on the M500. It's something that's there. You can use it if you want to. I personally choose not to, and I've done all of my testing with it switched off. But you do have the choice of the valve mode or the transistor mode, valve being second order harmonics, transistor mode being third order harmonics, so you can play around with it if you want to and switch it off if you don't. Where all that leaves us is that the DX7 Pro Plus is kind of like just an upgraded DX5. And what I mean by that is it's got a few extra features in terms of the sound color, it's got the balance control, it gives you I2S and AES, and a tiny bit more power as well. But beyond that, it's going to come down to whether it sounds better, to see if it can knock off the M500 as an overall package, or the EF400 on sound quality alone. Starting off comparing the DX7 Pro Plus to the M500, and I was listening to Communicate by Dire Straits. With the aria, the DX7 sounds clean and punchy, really well controlled and really well delivered. Mark Knopfler's vocals were nicely focused, there's good separation of the sounds, and the stage size is overall pretty good. Moving over with the arias to the M500 though, and what I heard was a slightly better sound still. The M500 gave me a little bit more sense of punch, and a slightly more articulate overall sound. And this really surprised me. I honestly expected the DX7 Pro Plus to be clearly superior to both the DX5 and the M500. But what I was hearing as I listened was that, from a subjective point of view, I think the M500 is a more enjoyable sound. Both are great. I would not complain for a second about having to listen to the DX7 Pro Plus, but the M500 just adds a dash of realism and life to the sound through that extra sense of articulation and punch that it brings. It's not colouring the sound, it's not vastly changing the sound, it's just a bit more articulate, a bit more fluid. In contrast, the DX7 sounds a bit tighter overall, like it's kind of holding onto the music more. But in doing so, it's like it's slightly subduing the music as well. It's pulling just a little bit of the life out of the music, whereas the M500 is letting that life go free. Now, I know these are very intangible terms, but it's a really hard concept to describe. Moving back and forth between the two, both of them sound good, as I've already said, but this one just sounds more lifelike, more alive, and more engaging, without changing the tonality much. If I had to split hairs between the two and find a way that the DX7 Pro Plus might be preferable, it's possible that the DX7 Pro Plus is coming across as being a bit more precise with the sound, but again, it's really hard to describe and define it because it's not tonally changing the sound, it's just the character of how the notes are delivered. And for me, I definitely prefer and enjoy the sound of the M500, but there'll be those of you, I'm sure, that feel like the DX7 Pro Plus is just a bit more precise, a bit more kind of surgical with its sound potentially, but for me it is coming at the cost of sounding a bit more like a recording and a bit less like a more live experience. And so to help try to make some of this a bit more tangible, a bit more understandable, let me talk you through the first 30 odd seconds of Communicate by Dire Straits on both of these devices, listening to the arias. The opening guitar line from the DX7 is very crisp. It's a bit crisper, maybe a little bit cleaner from the DX7, but the M500 to me sounds more like the guitar is in the room with me. And what I mean by that is I feel like you can hear a bit more of the resonance of the guitar, whereas the DX7 is probably a bit more textural, but it's cutting off some of that resonance. In a similar vein, the bass guitar sounds a bit more full from the M500. It's like the M500 allows it to resonate for just a fraction of a second longer, whereas the DX7 kind of clamps it down faster. And that's why I say some people are going to feel like this is more precise, but I feel like this is more lifelike. When the piano and drums come in after a little while, once again, I feel like that sense of resonance, that slight sense of kind of space in the room and space for the instruments to breathe, that goes again to the M500. Whereas the DX7 just kind of locks it all down and it sounds very precise, but it sounds like a precise recording, not a live performance. And I'm not suggesting the M500 is perfect. It still sounds like a recording, but it sounds closer to reality than what I'm hearing from the DX7 Pro Plus. And so to summarise the comparison between the DX7 Pro Plus and the M500 Mk3, what I'd say is that if you are only listening to one or the other, they're both going to sound fantastic. So don't think that one is good and one is bad, they're both excellent devices. But for me, I do slightly prefer the M500, as I've no doubt made clear, And so for me, if I was in your shoes, I'd probably think about whether you like that super precise sound that maybe sucks a bit of the life out of the sound. If you enjoy something like a THX789, then you're probably going to like the sound of the DX7. And also think about whether you need the extra power. Remember, we've got 1 watt into 32 ohms versus 1.9, so nearly double. We've also got I2S here, and that is going to bring the sound closer. So my comparisons were done USB and USB. If you do plug in the I2S, it does make the sound just a bit more refined from the DX7 Pro Plus. I still think I slightly prefer the M500, but it's a much closer call. And so for me, ultimately, I would lean towards the M500, but I'd also be recommending that you weigh up the feature sets. Maybe you need the balance control, in which case it's the DX7 Pro Plus. Maybe you need or want the I2S, in which case it's the DX7 Pro Plus. But maybe you're just looking for maximum sound enjoyment. If that's the case, you might actually need to compare it to the EF400. Listening to the EF400 versus the DX7 Pro Plus, still on communique by dire straits. And the EF400 produces a sound which is clearly richer and smoother than the DX7 Pro Plus, but it definitely comes at a loss of a little bit of perceived detail. That was starting in non-oversampling mode, which is tending to be my preference for the EF400, and switching to oversampling mode does close the gap on that sense of definition in the sound, but either way, the EF400 still sounds what I would describe as the most organic. It sounds lifelike, there's a better sense of space between all the sounds, and so for me, the EF400 probably still is the best possible sound for me. It's the one that sounds the most lifelike, it has the best sense of separation, it's got a lovely sense of dynamics. But I should clarify here that the EF400, DX7 Pro Plus and M500 are all pretty close here. If I had to put them on a continuum, let's say this is like maximum richness and lushness, and this is maximum sterility down here. What I would say is the EF400 is just a bit warmer than neutral, or a bit richer than neutral is probably a better term. I think the M500 is sitting pretty close to dead center, and the DX7 Pro Plus is just a hair further along the continuum than the M500, but they're all very close together. And so for me, the EF400 is still the pick from a sonic point of view, so long as you're not running high impedance headphones. And if you are running high impedance headphones, it seems to vary a little bit, but I wouldn't recommend this for predominantly high impedance use, as I've already said. And for me at this stage, the M500 is still my preference in terms of performance and price combined. It's significantly cheaper than the DX7 Pro Plus, and other than the power output and the extra inputs, it doesn't really miss out on any key features. Except balance control, of course, if that's important to you, and if it is important to you, it's probably a deal breaker that it's not on the M500. But for me, in my use case, it's the M500 for price, features and overall performance for the price, and it's the EF400 currently for pure sound quality. But of course we're not done yet, there is one more player in this race. Looking now at the $850 FiiO K9 Pro ESS, and we're taking a full $150 jump in price from the DX7 Pro Plus. This is a unit that I've reviewed in depth before, so check out that review if you want the details. But to give you a summary of the key similarities and differences here, the K9 Pro ESS uses the same chip as the M500 and the DX7 Pro Plus, but this time it's using 2 of those chips. Having said that, it's not superior everywhere, because the K9 Pro ESS handles lower sample rates, it only goes to DSD 256 if that matters, and there's no DSD capability on SPDIF, either optical or coaxial, but it does have high-res Bluetooth, it does do MQA, it's got truly balanced headphone outputs, and the most confirmed power into 32 ohms. The K9 Pro ESS will output 2.1 watts into 32 ohms, and remember that we don't know exactly where the 4.4 watts figure is for the EF400, so the K9 Pro ESS is looking pretty strong on paper. Really the only thing that's lacking for it that something else has here is the I2S input, which this doesn't have, or the AES, but I'm more interested in the I2S these days. I think the design of the K9 Pro ESS is fantastic, with the one exception being that the labeling of all these switches and buttons is pretty much invisible unless you've got a bright light and you're right up close to it. And it's got some really nice features accessible via the app, where you can do things like play with the EQ, it's got balance control. It's also worth mentioning that this is a digital volume control. Even though it's a smooth turning knob, it is digital volume, so it's precise in the same way that the M500 and the 2 toppings are. So on paper, and based on my past experience before I tried some of these others, the K9 Pro ESS is looking really strong. And so I fired it up, comparing it to the EF400 from a pure sound quality point of view. One of the tracks I used for this test was Down to the Nightclub by Tower of Power, and starting with the arias on the EF400 in oversampling mode, the sound was clean and detailed and spacious. Moving back over to the K9 Pro, and the sound felt much flatter overall. It didn't have anywhere near the sense of space that the EF400 gave me, And being a live recording, this track can throw a really nice sense of space if the device will deliver it. The K9 Pro ESS still sounded good, but it was very clear that it was lacking the sense of overall space in the soundstage when compared to the EF400. No doubt for me, the overall tonality and sound quality of the EF400 was clearly the better sound. Even though the K9 Pro ESS sounded good, if you were deciding purely on sonics, to me it's a no contest and the EF400 wins. But what if you needed more features? What if the feature set from the EF400 is missing something you absolutely need? That's where the K9 Pro ESS is really strong, but I was then curious to know, how does it compare to the others in this roundup? I found the DX7 Pro Plus offers a slightly fuller sound than the K9 Pro ESS, which actually sounds a little bit, not sterile, but quite cool, quite lean in comparison with the DX7 Pro Plus, which is by no means a warm sounding device. But it goes to show you that there's kind of a range of what can be considered neutral until you compare things and you really hear the differences. I also feel like the DX7 Pro Plus provided a slightly better sense of depth in the soundstage than the K9 Pro ESS. And it really highlighted for me the fact that the ESS doesn't give you a great sense of depth, putting the K9 Pro ESS up against the M500, and the sound quality takes another step again in favour of the M500. And this really surprised me. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with the K9 Pro ESS, and so it's really shocked me that I've now got two products on my desk that are cheaper and are sounding even better. That's not a knock on the K9 Pro ESS, it's going to show you how good the M500 and the DX7 Pro Plus are. And so at this point, I had some really interesting conclusions. And I'm not done yet, but let me give you a quick summary of how these perform just as all-in-ones driving headphones. And I'm going to come back around in a moment and talk about them with IEMs and also as DAC or preamps only. But talking about them now just as all-in-one units, where you've got maybe USB going in, a pair of headphones plugged in, and you're just enjoying their sound direct to your headphones. To sum them up in that context, for me the M500 is the clear standout. When combining price, the sound quality, which is the best of the bunch, second to the EF400 for me, and the feature set, the M500 is an absolute beast. For me, the DX7 Pro Plus comes in a very, very close second. It's not quite as good as the M500 from a sonic perspective, but it's got more power, it's got I2S, it's got balance control, and some of you are going to prefer the design, no doubt. The K9 Pro ESS has kind of been bumped to third place for me because it's got slightly more features than the other two, but the sound quality from those is clearly better in my opinion. And finally, the EF400 kind of sits on its own because for me, it's got the best sound of all of them, but there is such a massive gulf in the feature set. And it also doesn't seem to play well with high impedance headphones. So it's kind of got a niche position, and it's number one in sound quality with lower impedance headphones. But it drops back so quickly in terms of features and with high impedance cans that I really don't know where to put it. I will put it number one for sound quality for low impedance cans, but for everything else, I'm probably going to go for the M500 as my absolute top. And finally, I don't want to not mention the DX5. The DX5 is still great, but given that for just $80 more, you can get what I consider to be the best value in this whole roundup, for that little bit more money, I just think the M500 makes so much more sense than the DX5 now. But as I said, let's not quite stop there just yet. I'm not going to crown any of these as the ultimate winners because there's a bit more we need to talk about. And the first part of that is how each of these perform with IEMs. And the generally good news is that anything here with a digital volume control, so that's the DX5, the DX7 Pro Plus, the M500 Mk3, and the K9 Pro ESS, with all of those, they've got beautifully black backgrounds, no hiss whatsoever when I was using the Monarch Mark IIs, and they've got plenty of volume range where you can get a decent amount of volume, a good amount of adjustment, and no channel imbalance. Sadly, I can't say the same thing for the EF400, particularly if you want to run it balanced. What you're going to get there is a very limited volume range, so it's already getting quite loud at about 9 o'clock on the volume, and that means you're not getting a large range of adjustment, and you're also only just getting out of channel imbalance. Of course, you can use it single-ended, and I think the single-ended output sounds fine, but there will be those that feel like the balance is significantly better because of that little bit of extra separation it gives you, and if you are one of those people, you're either going to need some kind of device like an IEM match, or you're going to need to choose a different source altogether. And so that kind of seals it for me that if you're thinking about these just as all-in-ones where you're not running external amplifiers or anything like that, the M500 is clearly the winner. The EF400 maintains its sort of niche spot, where it's not good with high impedance cans necessarily, it's pretty hard to use effectively with IEMs, and it's got a very, very limited feature set. But if you do happen to be running a pair of lower impedance, say 30 ohm to 50 or 60 ohm cans, the EF400 is fantastic on a sound quality point of view. Just don't look for any extra features, of course. And so having crowned the M500, there is one more thing I want to cover off, and that changes the landscape again. And that is how these perform as DACs. So I hooked all of these up to the Sparkos Labs Aries amplifier, which is a very high quality, outstanding amplifier. And I maxed out the levels so they're all running as basically a line out, not a variable output, and compared them running as pure DACs. So this is for that scenario where maybe you want to use it sometimes as an all-in-one where you can just plug in a headphone and listen, but the majority of the time maybe you're going to use it more as a DAC. In that situation, the performance of these is quite variable, as I'll talk you through now. And these are in no particular order, they're just the order that I grabbed them in and did the testing in. Starting off with the EF400, connecting that up to the Sparkos Labs Aries, I heard a significant leap in performance. And what I mean by that is the sound I was getting from the Aries amplifier was significantly better than what I was hearing from the internal amps of the EF400. And what that does mean is that if you do want to use the EF400, but you have got high impedance headphones, then you can happily run an external amplifier and maximize your performance. It also tells us that the DAC in the EF400 is a very nice DAC, and it's actually being slightly limited by the quality of the amplification stage. That's not to say that it's a bad amp in the EF400, but it is to say that the DAC has even more to give. As a little side note, for those of you that might be interested, I decided to check if the EF400 could maybe replace the Bifrost 2 as my go-to recommendation for a sub $1,000 kind of multi-bit R2R type DAC. And the answer is it can't. The Bifrost 2 is still the better device, so if you are looking for a dedicated DAC, the EF400 isn't the best choice in that sub $1,000 category. I still think the Bifrost 2 is, and that's not even including the new upgrade card, which I'm hoping to get my hands on. Specifically, what I heard from the Bifrost 2 was a sound that was more spacious and lively. The EF400 sounded a little bit muted in comparison to the Bifrost 2 and with less space as well. Again, that's not to say the EF400 is bad, the point being that you're spending the money in the Bifrost 2 on a pure DAC, whereas your budget is split between the amplifier and the DAC when you're buying an EF400. And so I just wanted to contextualize that one. It's a lovely DAC, it works really nicely with an external amp, but it's not punching at Bifrost 2 levels. Moving on from the EF400, the next product I tried was the K9 Pro ESS, and this has an absolutely exceptional DAC in it. And so this is where I say the tables kept turning. I'd gone from finding the K9 Pro ESS to kind of being third rung on the ladder here, to now feeling like it was actually the best DAC of the bunch other than the EF400 and probably alongside of it in some ways. And so for me, the K9 Pro ESS is being held back a bit by its amp, and to me it's a great option if you're looking for a fantastic DAC that happens to have headphone outputs for those times you don't care about maximum sound quality, but it's still going to sound good enough for what you're doing. Moving over to the DX7 Pro Plus, and what I heard there was a sound that was a slight upgrade going from the internal amplifier to the Sparkos Labs Aries, and that doesn't say that the DX7 Pro Plus amplifier is exceptional, it tells us that the DAC doesn't have a huge amount more to give. That also doesn't mean that it's a bad DAC in there, but it's about on par with the amplifier stage, and that's probably not a bad thing. Likewise, the M500 performed very similarly, and so what that tells us is that the M500 DAC and amp are roughly on the same level, and that again is a good thing and a bad thing. It means that if you're using this on its own, it's sounding about as good as it can, but there's not a huge range for upgrades with external amps. A couple of little quirks that I do want to mention with the M500 is that once I set its output to a fixed line out mode where the volume control doesn't change the rear outputs, what I found was that it no longer showed me the volume for the headphone output either. And while that's not a huge deal, I did prefer being able to see the volume on the front panel, but I also don't want to have to constantly turn it to 0 dB or then all the way back down again when using variable line outputs on the back or a headphone output on the front. So it would have been really nice if there was a way for the fixed line output on the back to not disable the volume control for the headphones. Likewise, as with all of these units with balanced headphone connectors, because those don't have the short circuiting switch like a 6.3mm does, they can't automatically tell when you've plugged in your headphones. And so all of them do require some manual switching to go between headphone mode and line out mode. And it is one area where the M500 is a little bit of a fiddle because you've got to go through a couple of menu steps to get to that switch. Whereas with the toppings, it's quickly and easily available with the front toggle switches in the volume knobs. And in the case of the K9 Pro ESS, it's an actual switch on the front of the device. And so as you can probably see at this point, none of these are perfect. A lot of which of these is the best is going to come down to how you're going to use it, what you prioritize, what you're using it with. There are lots of different variables. So let me try to sum everything up now and pull it all together into a coherent picture. Starting at the bottom in terms of budget, the DX5 is fine. It's a good solid unit still. I will still recommend it for that sub $500 market, but it's really outclassed by everything else here. The M500 Mk3 is my clear favourite in terms of price, features and performance combination, but it is worth remembering that it doesn't give you a huge ability to upgrade with external amps, and if you are switching regularly between the headphone outputs and the line outputs, it is a little bit of a cumbersome process. It's not a big deal, it's a couple of presses of a button, but it's a bit fiddly if you want to just change on the fly. The DX7 Pro Plus is the easier product to use if you're going constantly between headphones and the line out. It's much easier to switch, in other words, but much like the M500, you're not getting a big benefit with external amplifiers. And from a pure sonics perspective, I still think the M500 is the better sounding device. The EF400 down here, for me, is probably the best sounding product on a low impedance headphone, but for some reason that sound changes with high impedance headphones, it doesn't work particularly well with IEMs, and it's got no features to speak of other than oversampling and not oversampling. It also has no preamp functionality if that matters, so the volume control on the front is only for the headphone outputs. And then finally we've got the K9 Pro ESS here, which is not as good as the M500 or the DX7 Pro Plus from a pure all-in-one kind of driving a headphone directly point of view, but it gives you a fantastic set of features, and it's also the best of all in terms of being able to provide a line out, a variable line out, and some of the best sound coming out of the DAC in this entire roundup. And so if I were going to choose one of these for myself, it would be the M500 for versatility, it would be the EF400 for pure headphone driving sound quality, unless it's high impedance, sorry I have to keep saying that, or it would actually be the K9 Pro ESS for maximum versatility, but that would be with the assumption that I was going to be running external amplifiers as well. None of this is to knock either of the top-end units, I think they're both really solid devices. They just happen to be pipped for me by a slightly cheaper device in the case of the M500, a slightly better sounding device in the case of the EF400, and a slightly more versatile device in the case of the K9 Pro ESS. And so there's no clear-cut winners here, as you probably knew coming into this because I very rarely do clear-cut winners. But there are some really strong standouts. The M500 for me in many ways is the hero of this roundup. This is the one for me that I'm now most likely to have on my desk, but I'm interested to know which one would you want on your desk out of these and why? Put a comment down below and I'll look forward to seeing your thoughts. For now though, I hope this review has been useful and helpful. Thank you for watching all the way through if you've made it to this point. And if you have enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you hit the like button. Consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.